We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky, vigorous as ever at the age of 84. Chomsky's popularity, or notoriety as some would say, endures because he is still criticizing politicians, business leaders, and other powerful figures for not acting in the public's best interest. At the heart of Chomsky's work, examining the ways elites use their power to control millions of people and pushing the public to resist. And it is his activism that keeps this U.S. scholar engaged in the public discourse well into his 9th decade. Today on Talk to Al Jazeera, a conversation with Noam Chomsky. Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Pleased to be with you.
You've described your life as taking two tracks. One, the track of political activism, and the other, the track of research into language, the study of linguistics. And over the years, you've noted that political activism has taken up more of your time and you'd like to spend more time on your research. First, how did the activism outpace the academic work?
Well, actually the activism for me long antedates the professional work. I grew up that way. So I was a political activist as a teenager in the 1940s, before I ever heard of linguistics. I really got back into it intensively back in the early 60s when things started to develop in many domains, civil rights, anti-war movement, all sorts of things. And I knew enough about it from experience to know that it's not the kind of thing you can put your toe in and then walk away. Once you get into it, it's all-encompassing. For one thing, it's urgent. There are real human beings involved and their needs and so on, and that plainly is more important on any moral scale than discovering something new about the structure of language. So it just tends to fill every empty space. And over the years, as active involvement in one or another thing, the number of issues and crises and engagements and demands just keeps going up. I mean, when I go home tonight, I'll write at least a dozen letters regretfully declining an invitation to do something because I can't, and it just keeps going up. So it does tend to crowd out other things.
Is it the responsibility of academics and other intellectuals to be engaged politically?
Or every other human being. I mean, responsibility basically is measured by opportunity. If you're a poor person living in the slums and you have to work 60 hours a week to put bread on the table, your responsibility is less than if you have a degree of privilege, for obvious reasons.
Now, is that now, if you have privilege, are you more obligated?
Yes,
to
the more
give back?
privilege you have, the more opportunity you have. The more opportunity you have, the more responsibility you have. It's elementary.
So why don't we see that in the United States? There's been so much talk about people getting richer, many, many more people growing poorer, and yet the rich are seemingly resistant to giving more of their time, of giving more of their wealth, giving more of their talent to the society.
For the most part, that's why they're rich. I mean, if you dedicate your life to enriching yourself and those are your values and you don't care what happens to anyone else, then of course you won't care what happens to anyone else. So it's self-selected. It's also institutional in its most extreme and pathological form. It's the Ayn Rand ideology. I just don't care about anyone else. I'm only interested in benefiting myself, and that's good and noble.
How do you change the institution? How do you change the system that says it's okay to be so selfish that all of your actions, that you don't, essentially you're not taking responsibility for your actions.
No, well, you're taking responsibility to yourself to maximize your own short-term gain. Actually, I should say there are much worse cases than systemic risk in bringing down the financial system. That's bad enough. But there's another externality that's much more severe, destruction of the species. And that's not a joke. It's imminent that global warming will cause a major catastrophe. You can argue about the details, but not much doubt that it's coming. And if you don't pay attention to it because it's an externality, I'm interested in gain, not what happens to my grandchildren, then you're going to accelerate the disaster. That's the most severe of all of them. But it goes from transaction about a car to that. That's just inherent in market systems. So how do you change it? Well, you constrain and control the system, or else just overcome it. So for example, it's not a law of nature. For example, in the 1950s and the 1960s, which was the biggest growth period in American history, financial institutions were regulated. The New Deal regulations were in place, and there were no financial crises, none. Banks functioned like banks. You put your money in them, they lend it to somebody who wants to, buy a house or send a kid to college or whatever it is. That's what banks are supposed to do. Now, starting in the 1970s, it changed pretty radically. There were decisions made, not laws of nature, to reconstruct the economy so as to undermine domestic production. It's called globalization. Send it out to Bangladesh. And to shift investment to finance rather than production. And partly that was because of the declining rate of profit in production. Partly it was just a decision. Well, that had all kinds of, these two things had tremendous consequences. That's what's called the neoliberal program. Everywhere it's been applied, virtually, it's been pretty harmful in different ways. Like in Latin America, where it was applied very severely, they had a couple of decades of disaster. In the Middle East, a large part of what lies behind, say, the Tahrir Square uprising is the brutal effects of the neoliberal programs that Mubarak was imposing following IMF and the World Bank, and that Morsi is now reinstating. And in the West, it's one effect is the austerity programs in Europe, which are devastating Southern Europe. In the United States, rich country, it had different effects. The effects are the dramatic concentration of wealth, the stagnation and or decline for much of the population, the increasing poverty, which you mentioned. For really repressed parts of the population, it really is a catastrophe.
So when you come back to the question of activism and your contention that every person needs to stand up, are you seeing in both the Occupy movement and in the numbers of people who came out in 2012 to try to protect the vote, to try to push for legislators who would put in more humane economic policies, do you see those seeds as being potentially fruitful for the United States? Or have things simply gone too far in the GALT direction?
Well, nothing's ever gone too far. Anything can be reversed. These are human decisions. But they have to. It has to gain much more power, momentum, and force. I mean, what the current direction is in the wrong trajectory. Actually, take a look at this morning's newspaper. Sometimes it's almost comical. Front page of today's New York Times. There's a story about AIG, huge insurance company, which was taking very risky actions in order to bring in high profit. And it crashed, and it was going to crash most of the economy. The big investment firms like Goldman Sachs would have collapsed and so on. So the taxpayer came in and rescued them. And now they're suing the government because there was too high an interest rate when they were bailed out. I mean, that's almost surreal, you know. I don't know what words you can use to describe it. I mean, the arrogance and the sense of, justification for myself, you know. I need everything, you know. The guy who's leading the suit is some multi-billionaire, you know. But it wasn't enough that they bailed him out and saved them from bankruptcy.
They should have done it for free.
They should have done it even with less of a cost to him, you know. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how you describe this. And that's the kind of, it's already, this suit has already imposed a considerable burden on the taxpayer just in litigation costs, and there'll be more. But that, you know, the arrogance that's, I don't know what word to use to describe it.
When you raise the point about a lot of the opposition to President Obama, particularly since his re-election, in part because of his race, in part because of what people think his policies are, I'm thinking of what has just happened here in the United States, his rounding out of his national security team, and watching already the criticisms of his choices. I'm wondering whether the criticism is simply driven out of a desire to deny the sitting president his nominees, or whether there are real questions being raised, in particular, about how the U.S. deals with groups such as Hamas, or with countries such as Iran, and whether or not the U.S. is undercutting its moral stature by continuing to use drones to take out targets. You know, and which is it? Are these legitimate questions that are being grappled with, or is this just about political blockage?
I mean, that would be a legitimate question, but unfortunately that's not what's being raised, except way at the margins. What's being raised is the opposite. We're not doing enough, we're not militant enough, we're not violent enough. Mm-hmm. There's almost no broad protest against the global assassination campaign, unfortunately. It's outrageous. It actually undercuts principles of Anglo-American law that go back to the 13th century.
Does President Barack Obama have a moral compass? And if he does, is he ignoring it at his own peril, at the country's peril?
It's an interesting question. During the last election, I happened to be talking to a well-known black activist, mm-hmm. Very much involved in civil rights and other activism, and he told me a story. He said that after Obama's first election, 2008, he was visited by a group of African-American women leading activists who wanted to talk to him. He said he was there when they came out of the meeting and asked them what it was like. And their answer was, this man has no moral center. That's their reaction. I think they're right. If you look at his policies, I think that's what they reveal. I mean, there's some nice rhetoric here and there, but you look at the actual policies, they're pretty shocking. The drone assassination campaign, it's a perfectly good example. I mean, it's just a global assassination campaign.
Were his efforts to try to keep Israel from expanding settlements in the West Bank?
He didn't make the effort. He said a couple of words.
Token effort?
There was no effort. I mean, just look at his predecessors. Say George Bush the First. I mean, when Israel was that first Bush administration, they didn't really oppose the expansion of settlements, but they were opposed to the brazen, offensive way in which it was being done. Mm-hmm. So when, say, Secretary of State Baker would land in Jerusalem, the Prime Minister, Shamir, would announce that day, we're putting up a new settlement. Well, you know, patrician American elites don't like to be insulted to their face. So the Bush administration actually imposed penalties. Did Obama do anything? No, he just said, it's not helpful. Mm-hmm. And then at the Security Council, February 2011, there was actually a resolution which was calling for implementation of official U.S. policy. Mm-hmm. Obama vetoed it. what does that tell you? He's telling Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders, I'll tap you on the wrist, but go ahead and do what you like. And in fact, during the settlement freeze, take a look at what happened. It didn't stop. Construction continued in East Jerusalem. Projects that were started were continued. There were all sorts of exceptions. And the U.S. did nothing. So, in fact, Obama is actually the first president who hasn't really imposed restrictions on Israel. There's one interesting case right now. It's the case of what's called E1. You know, there's this corridor between the town of Ma'ale Adumim and Greater Jerusalem, which for 20 years Israel's been wanting to build there. That would complete the virtual bisection of the West Bank.
Without it, there could be no contiguous Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, actually there can't be anyway, but
right.
with this, it kind of ends it. Every American president has blocked it. And in fact, what Israel's had to do is sort of find devious ways around it, like putting up a police station or something, but they haven't been able to develop it. Now they've announced that they're going to develop it. Obama's reaction and Hillary Clinton was, it wouldn't be helpful. In other words, we're not going to do anything about it. Well, and in fact the U.S. continues to support it, provides the economic aid, military aid, diplomatic support, and so on that allows it to continue. Israeli leaders can see that. They don't care about a statement saying it's not helpful. Yeah, fine, it's not helpful, okay. So it's just the opposite. He's been unusually soft on Israel. In fact, just about every president has blocked things, including the second George Bush, not Obama. And in fact, if you look back at his record, it's not surprising. I actually wrote about this before the 2008 primaries, just looking at his webpage, you know, his self-advertising, and it was pretty striking. There's this big section on the Middle East, and it's almost all about love for Israel. There's practically nothing about Palestinians. I mean, maybe they should have some rights or something. But what was interesting was Lebanon. This was, remember, right after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. And he describes with pride the fact that he co-sponsored a Senate resolution calling on the executive not to do anything to hamper the Israeli invasion, and furthermore to punish Syria and Iran if they tried to impede it. I don't have to describe to you what the invasion was like. That's what he was boasting about. What can you expect? You know?
One quick final point on the media, something very close to my heart. We're coming into the U.S. and it has, for lack of a better phrase, upset some people. What is it about sources of information, about language, that makes people think that they have to try to control it?
They don't like what it says. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, why doesn't anyone report the fact that there's a very straightforward way to deal with what's alleged to be the gravest threat to peace in the world? Well, they don't want to hear that. And that's pretty normal. In the case of Al Jazeera, there's something else as well. There's a background of anti-Muslim racism, which is quite deep, and that's part of it. And it is deep. Actually, one of the funniest press conferences I've ever read about, it was partially recorded, was a couple of years ago under the Bush administration. The Emir of Qatar came to Washington, and Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, tried to urge him to call off Al Jazeera. He didn't like the things they were reporting. And the Emir, I suppose, with a sense of humor or something, gave a press conference in which he sort of gave a mocking speech in which he informed the press about this thing called freedom of the press and how he wasn't going to interfere and so on and so forth. Barely reported, but must have been pretty funny. I wish I'd been there. But there's a double, and it's true that Al Jazeera, you could read about, say, the bombing of Lebanon, you could see the bombing of Lebanon, the bombing of Gaza, you know, things happening in Iraq on Al Jazeera, which you couldn't see here. Literally couldn't see them. Because I think at the time, Al Jazeera had 2 small cable stations that were running it. And one of them in Michigan, where there's a big Arab population, and one somewhere up in northern New Hampshire or something. But basically, you couldn't see it, you know, unless you went to the internet, and nobody knows to do that. And now yes, they picked up a cable station, and as you say, there's protests, small cable outlet, because you got to control information. And that's been understood for a long time. In fact, it's quite striking that there are industries devoted to controlling attitudes and opinions, very specific, explicitly. It's called the public relations industry. You take a look at its founding, its documents, and so on. The goal is control attitudes and opinion. And it's quite striking that the industry developed in the freest countries in the world. It developed in England and the United States about a century ago. And they were the countries that, plenty of restrictions, but they were the most free countries. And the business world and the conservative elements understood very well that it's getting harder to control people by force. You know, the British Conservative Party, you know, it's hard to control people by force. They're getting too many rights. You know, parliamentary labor parties, women getting the right to vote, and so on. So we got to move on to controlling attitudes and opinions. That's the next way to control people. And so these huge industries developed, which are dedicated to that. And it's exactly what they do. And furthermore, in a sense, everyone knows it, but nobody sees it. So suppose you turn on a television set. There's advertising. That's the main task of the PR industry, commercial advertising. If you ever took a course in economics, you were taught that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. Okay, turn on a television set and look at an ad. Are they trying to create informed consumers who will make rational choices? Like if you see somebody driving a new car off into space, you know, with a football player and a sexy actress, is that trying to create an informed consumer making a rational choice?
It feels emotional.
Well, the whole thing is to try to create uninformed consumers making irrational choices. Now, going back to responsibility of intellectuals, they ought to be pointing out that this huge industry is largely devoted to undermining markets. Well, suppose you turn to elections, which they now run. The PR industry basically runs the elections. Are they trying to, you look at television ads, are they trying to create informed voters who will make a rational choice? No, quite the opposite. They want to undermine democracy by creating uninformed voters who will make irrational choices. So we have this huge industry spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year dedicated to undermining markets and democracy, and nobody says it. I mean, it's transparent, you know. It's not profound. I can explain it to my 10-year-old grandchildren, but try to find somebody who says it. No, it's just too deeply ingrained. We have to keep the mass of the population uninformed, marginalized, so that we, you know, the responsible men, can run things. And this is very explicit across the board. Progressive intellectuals, others. I mean, it's understandable. We are the elites, and we should be in control. And the rabble out there are stupid and ignorant, and for their own benefit, we've got to delude and control them. It's like you don't let a 3-year-old run into the street. You know, that's the way we have to treat the population. It's all very explicit, and it takes a kind of genius not to see it. You know.
I know that you are extremely busy. You've said to others, I spend so much time on my work, I don't have time to go to the movies or go out to dinner. I feel bad that I took up your time. We should have just gone out to dinner. Right. So, Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you.